A very happy morning and a warm welcome to all the wonderful people here. Thank you very much for being here on a Friday morning. This is Rashmi from WMG. I would like to start by quoting a beautiful saying from Sri Mahatria. Without God, I cannot. Without me, God will not. God and me, anything is possible. So let's start today's event with silent prayers to the Almighty Lord to bless one and all here. We at WMG have always believed in nurturing relationships beyond business. So we have always been very ambitious and passionate about platforms like these to bring sharp minds together. There is also an attempt at the center to move these budget discussions outside Mumbai and Delhi and to reach out to more people. We were to have our Honorable FM Nirmala Sitharamanji, Dr. Arvind Virmani, and Mr. Zarabi amongst us, but because of some scheduling in their meeting, they were not able to join us. In fact, we have Mr. Arvind Virmani and Siddharth Zarabi joining us through a video conference. Dr. Virmani, Indian economist, was appointed India's representative to the International Monetary Fund in 2009. Prior to that, he was the chief economic advisor to the Government of India. He has also been an advisor to the Indian government at the highest levels, including as Principal Advisor, Planning Commission. Mr. Virmani attended the Doon School. He later graduated with a degree in economics from St. Stephen's College, Delhi, and from California Institute of Technology, following graduated with a doctorate in economics from Harvard University. He'll be addressing us through our VC.
Okay. Yeah. So this is the first time I'm doing it, giving a talk like this. I like to see the faces of the people I'm talking to, but unfortunately, of course, I couldn't come because of the engagement in the afternoon. So what I'm going to do is give a overview of what's happened in the economy, and then go on to give the solutions which I have analyzed. Now, this talk is actually based on a research paper I've been working on for the last month or so, which hopefully I'll have out in a couple of weeks. Basically, there are three parts in which I will speak. The first part is is the growth slowdown, a little bit of a puzzle, and what that implies. Secondly, on underlying causes, and the third on the policies which kind of follow from the previous analysis. Now, if you look at what happened a year or so ago in 2015-16, we had 4 quarters of growth decline, which incredibly exactly mirror the first 4 quarters of the decline we've had this time, from peak to trough, and the numbers almost match exactly identically. So that previous growth decline was followed by a V-shaped recovery. So people would not have been totally amiss to think before the 1920 numbers started coming in, based on the first 4 quarters, that a similar thing may happen here. So one of the questions which arises is, what is different? Another episode which is worth as a kind of analogy is the global financial crisis. In that case, the trigger, the event was very visible. It was an external event which hit the economy, and it was visible and frightening actually. But it turned out that we were all very focused. We had a very focused policy approach to it, and we were able to get back on track within actually 2 quarters. We just had 2 quarters of decline. So again, this episode is kind of different from that there is still a lot of confusion among many minds. Of course, some people who analyze these things are 100% sure, but the general whether it's in the government or economic advisors or bureaucrats, whoever, are still a little confused about the exact problem involved. So this is how I put it, that there was a build-up of problems over the last decade or so, actually, and certain events prior to 2014 and certain things after 2014, which built up problems. And then there was a trigger. We often find in macroeconomics that this is a combination. There is a build-up and there's a trigger, which is kind of like a bubble building up and bursting. So what are the underlying causes? Many of these have been discussed in public domain, but I put it into kind of four buckets or categories. One I would call the campaign against corruption. The second I would put in the bracket of institutional change in monetary and credit policies or regulatory policies. And the third one in the fiscal domain. It's just useful to categorize these and then look at each one. Now, you're all familiar with the host of laws, etc., anti-black money laws, etc., but people forget that it started actually in 2011 with some Supreme Court cases and agitation started by Anna Hazare. So it has its origins well before this government took over. Of course, the government started with the setting up of SIT on black money, and then a host of laws, including RERA, culminating in demonetization. Now, the theory was that if we act on black money, people will move to the white money, and the decline in black money economy or black economy would be more than compensated by the productivity and growth in the white economy. So overall, the economy would actually grow faster after some time. Unfortunately, that assumption has not been fulfilled. So that is one of the reasons for this underlying problem, that in a way, if one looks at it a little simplistically, the black economy was suppressed quite significantly, but the white economy, for various reasons, some of which I'll just come to, was not able to rise as much, was not given the required incentives to rise, and therefore we had this depression. The second underlying cause is the monetary policy. Again, all of you are familiar with the monetary policy, the new monetary policy framework, the increase in regulatory emphasis starting from around 2014-15 with Raghuram Rajan, the PCA framework, etc. A whole bunch of regulatory measures, including, of course, the IBC, which was on a separate track but could be seen as part of a improvement in regulatory structures affecting financial markets, etc. And the thing is that as a result of this structure, the monetary policy took a U-turn. We had negative repo rates for years and years, for decades, and they suddenly hardened and became very positive. So you have a complete change which is disrupting the whole economic system. And similarly, you had a whole period of 5 years. Again, I won't go down because I'm sure you want to listen to the recommendations or solutions. But the buildup of bad debts started from the 2009 crash. Hello? Hello?
So we can hear you.
Oh, okay, my thing has gone dead. I don't know why. Or maybe it needs a... Oh, you can still hear me? Yeah,
Yes.
okay. So this whole thing about infrastructure, the push for infrastructure, the whole issue of telephone banking, the evergreening, it has been going on from particularly in FY 11 and 12. It kind of heightened during that period. And then, of course, you started tightening the norms around 15, 16 and so on, and then with the IBC, etc., that suddenly these things started coming out and disrupting the system. So, so, so in some sense, you are trying to do institutional reform, but there is something which I call the J curve of reforms, which is that you may have a period of decline in productivity before you get the benefit. So this period seems to have been larger in these institutional changes. And finally, of course, the history of this, you know, that it culminated in the ILFS crisis last year. So that kind of acted as a trigger to the disruption. And finally, you had the fiscal. So on one hand, when the government came in, it had promised the corporate tax reforms, but these were delayed for financial reasons, fiscal reasons. So the FRBM, which has been in abeyance since 2010 or so, was brought back, and the fiscal stance was certainly tightened gradually. So that was another change, but the effect of that was that certain reforms which were even planned, like the corporate tax reform, got delayed. And then when there were shortfalls, like the introduction of the GST, there were cesses and surcharges were put on, and the capital gains tax, and then the big surcharges in the budget in April. So that budget, the part B of the budget, I would say, kind of acted as another trigger to the whole thing. I'll move on. I'm sure you're more interested in the solution, so I'll leave that there. So you have this institutional changes which are happening. You are trying to move the economy into a better systemic framework, but you have negative effects arising which were not really perceived very clearly by most people. So it's not a question of just the government, but most economists. And then you have a trigger of the ILFS default, and instead of what people probably expected, a corporate tax reform completion in the budget, you had further surcharges. So these things together, in my view, triggered the what you saw in the fifth and sixth quarter, which is the first two quarters of the new year. Okay, so really the solutions are kind of connected with what has happened. I'm not giving you all the details, but the solutions kind of mirror that. Monetary credit policy I've been discussing for many years, so I'll just kind of list it. I believe that the monetary policy is still too tight. That requires two or three things. One is the real repo rate should be down to zero. We have to pay a lot more attention to money growth, which I have been saying for a long time. In fact, I disagreed with Raghu in his committee when he proposed the monetary policy framework. And whether you call it long-term liquidity or whatever the terms you give, this is the new research shows that it's critical to transmission. You know, people keep talking about transmission, but what the research shows is that in emerging markets economies particularly, the monetary growth is an important variable. The repo doesn't do everything. And finally, of course, the most important part is the way I put it is the unclogging of the credit loan channels. Now again, some effort has been made on all these elements, but it's now much more urgent, especially the last element for the elimination of kind of systemic risk in the financial system. Unfortunately, the way it has been handled right from 2010-11 has not been the most efficient and optimal. But anyway, now that we are in this situation, this has to be cleaned up. Next, of course, is the fiscal policy. Again, certain steps have already been taken, like the corporate tax reform. And I must say that the measures which went further for attracting supply chains and new manufacturing were a surprise to me, a very, very pleasant surprise. I think I had been talking about the once in a generation opportunity to attract the supply chains, and this was a very, very good step to do that. I would just add that early in this year, I had in fact told RBI that you should get ready to um, get huge capital inflows. Yesterday, I just heard another analyst on business TV saying the same thing. So this really is a game changer and probably still underappreciated by most people. The second one, again, one has been talking about this right from from 2017, the GST. We have repeatedly said that the GST is too complex, and that is particularly true. You know, the corporate tax is very important for large companies, but really the GST affects everybody. And people, again, I don't think whether it's within the government or outside, enough people realize what a negative effect a complicated versus a simplified GST has on both compliance and monitoring and so on in revenue collection. I think a simpler system is more revenue maximizing than anything that has been done so far. So that is critical. The third one, of course, is the direct tax code. This has been bubbling or in the works for, I don't know, 10 to 15 years. And I think it's very important now that it's been examined by a committee appointed by the government, which has given its report. I believe it's very, very important to introduce this direct tax code. And again, many people, I'm sure the financial people like you realize it, but many people don't realize that the importance of this to the economy is not the taxation of salaried people, it's business. So leaving aside corporations, this code affects every business in the country. It's the business taxation which is critical, and it's a big mess. If you talk to small people, that huge direct tax code is really a disgrace, and it urgently needs to be reformed. So the basic law, that law and simplification, and this is all in the recommendations. One of the objections to doing this is that at this time, the fiscal system would be disrupted, that you may have a higher fiscal deficit, but there are ways to phase out, let's say, the cesses and the surcharges, which reportedly has been recommended by this committee. I have no inside information. And you can phase them out. The key critical thing is to be done now is the law, the structure and legal framework of this taxation needs to be urgently changed. And that these two things together, GST simplification and direct tax, will give a boost to the entire, self-employment, small sector, SME, you name it. It will affect all of them much, much more than large companies. Very quickly, some of the other issues are, again, which are in the works, but I think, again, are quite critical, is the payment of outstanding dues, strategic sale, which has been promised. I think it's very important for the government. The first one or two real instances which everybody says is a strategic sale, or whichever word one wants to use, privatization or whatever, but that, one can talk about it 100 times, but the key is increases your credibility is that first, second sale, and then people are willing to wait and give the benefit of time to you. The third set of recommendations, I don't know how much time I have. I can maybe stop, maybe I'll just mention them and then stop for Q&A this time. So we've all talked about labor, land policies. The trick here from my 20 years of recommending policy is to focus, if it is difficult to do the complete reform, for example, everybody has talked about the industrial IDR, the 100 limit for kind of closing a company or for firing people. Now, I think it can be thought that some way, if the law can be changed specifically for coastal economic zones or SEZs or specific labor-intensive industries where there is huge scope for attracting global supply chains at this point, or so the trick in this reform is to focus it. If you can't do everything, select and focus it. So that is what I would recommend on this. Similarly, in land, I think the key issue for land right now is industrial estates and industrial clusters. So again, if one can, even if one cannot change the entire land laws, somehow if one can focus on these issues to promote employment and growth, that would be the way to go. There are other elements of labor. I think skilling is very important, and one of the things which is needed, which again people do not think of, is the change in the Apprenticeship Act. It is still, I believe, complicated in determining what is wage labor and what is an apprentice, and you need to facilitate apprenticeship, because that is the only way. One has heard many reports from employers who say that they cannot find the right skilled people. They advertise, they get thousands of applications, out of which not more than 10, 15 people are actually even worth considering. So you need to have these skilled people there. I just mentioned other things like agriculture and external reform, which are also relevant to this process of establishing credibility